Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and make a fairly prompt start and just do some of the background whilst people are still joining us. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the findings from our latest report on the attitudes of children and young people. So my name is Sarika Seshadri. I'm Joint Head of Research and Evaluation here at Women's Aid. I'd also like to welcome today our BSL interpreters, Anne-Marie and Sarah. We're striving to make this webinar accessible, so please do post any requirements that you may have in the Q&A function. We're going to start today with a bit of background, a brief bit of background to this research. The authors of the report, Catherine and Sarah, will then share the findings with you. Catherine Dean is Senior Research and Policy Officer here at Women's Aid, and Sarah David is Joint Head of Research and Evaluation. Then Yasmin and Georgie will present on our schools training offer, Expect Respect. Yasmin Razul is our Communities and Children and Young People Delivery Manager, and Georgie Friend is our CYP Training Officer. We're then going to have time for some questions. Please post any questions that you have in the Q&A function throughout the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. If we don't get through all of the questions, we will send a follow-up email, and that's also going to include a quick evaluation survey. So we would love everyone to fill that in. Also, if there is a lot of interest in a particular area, we may be able to look at some further discussions. So please do post questions, and we will be sharing the slides. So for the past couple of years, we've been exploring attitudes to domestic abuse. Attitudes set the scene for people's behaviours within relationships and how they're navigated. So investigating attitudes towards domestic abuse helps us to better understand where and why domestic abuse is being so-called tolerated in our society. So with this in mind, we published our Come Together campaign research in May of 2022. So you can find this on the Evidence Hub of our website, and the link is on this slide, which we'll be sharing. And one of the findings from this research was that young adults, so 16 to 24-year-olds, were less aware of healthy relationships than we'd have thought. They shared low levels of understanding of concepts of control in relationships, and they were more likely than other age groups to answer "don't know" when asked if harmful behaviours were wrong. So young men especially showed more tolerance and less awareness of domestic abuse than women in the same age group, and they were also more likely to hold underlying misogynistic views. And at the same time, we know that domestic abuse can never be truly addressed if we neglect to consider how abuse can be prevented. And fundamental to this is the knowledge, attitudes, and the behaviours of children and young people. So we were delighted to be successful in our bid to the Home Office Fund, What Works in Preventing Walk and Supporting Children. And this piece of work forms part of that Research in Practice project. So this means that our research will be informing a number of practice initiatives that we're developing, delivering training to children and young people in schools, developing online resources for children and young people, and expanding training to domestic abuse practitioners. We will, of course, be evaluating all of this, so there will be more reports to come. I'm now going to go ahead and hand over to Sarah to kick off with what we found in this report.
Sorry, thank you, Sarika. We're going to look at the findings in sections as set out on this slide. So I'm just going to start with a quick overview of our research questions, and then we'll talk about the findings in 3 parts and end with how we're using the research in practice. The report contains the full methodology, so I'm just highlighting some key points here today. We worked with a research and polling agency, ORB, to reach a nationally representative sample with 2 mainly quantitative surveys. We included questions aimed at understanding the perceptions and attitudes of children and young people around relationships, the belief systems that underpin these attitudes, and what influences both the belief systems and how to create change. Finally, we explored how education and digital interventions can help us to create change. And we draw on the findings of these two surveys in our research and the report that we published recently. This quantitative research opens up as many questions as it answers, as you'll see. This is part of a larger project for us, and qualitative work will follow in ways yet to be confirmed. We have already had some exciting conversations about further exploration with other organisations and hope to hear from many of you after today about setting up more in the future. So the first of the two surveys went out to 1,000 7 to 18-year-olds. Respondents were equally distributed across key stages 2 to 5. Questions were tailored for different age groups to ensure that they were appropriate and relevant to the curriculum. Samples for both of the surveys were nationally representative for gender and region, and both surveys used statements and scenarios about relationships to investigate attitudes, and this was building on the methodology from our 2022 survey of UK adults' attitudes to and tolerance of domestic abuse. The second survey then went to an older age group, so this also explored attitudes using scenarios, but it further explored recall around experiences of education. This age group was slightly harder to reach, and the sample fell slightly out of the national representation in terms of ethnicity, unlike the first survey, in order to ensure the quota of 1,000 was reached. I'm going to pass to Catherine now to look at the first part of the findings, and tell us a bit about educational preferences and knowledge around support.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning. So yes, straight into the findings. So to explore how education could be adapted to better support the learning around healthy and unhealthy relationships, we started by measuring what their existing awareness was, and also their existing understanding of these issues amongst children and young people. So the topics that we looked at were consent amongst Key Stage 3 to 5, or asking permission in Key Stage 2, controlling behaviour in Key Stage 2 to 5, domestic abuse in Key Stage 3 to 5, or unsafe relationships in Key Stage 2, healthy relationships, Key Stage 2 to 5, and sexual harassment, Key Stage 3 to 5, or unwanted touch in Key Stage 2. So what we found was that, firstly, respondents in Key Stage 2 provided the correct response least frequently, and that was across all different topics. So in Key Stage 2, we found that less than half of respondents, 47%, selected the correct definition for unsafe relationships. In the same key stage, 61% knew the correct definition of unwanted touch. And we thought that these findings show a really significant gap in the knowledge and confidence around these issues amongst primary school children, so that clearly needs to be addressed. We also found that girls were actually significantly more likely than boys to understand what was meant by specifically healthy relationships, controlling behaviour, and asking permission, which suggests that relationship, sex and health education should be improved to specifically target boys' relationship literacy in these areas. So the survey with 18 to 25-year-olds sought to measure to what extent they could recall learning about these topics themselves, when this was, and also how much of this knowledge had been retained. We found that biological sex education featured really strongly in the curriculum, and 75% of 18 to 25-year-old respondents that we surveyed recalled learning about that in secondary school. However, we found that around a third of 18 to 25-year-old respondents recalled no education on controlling behaviour, that's 35%, domestic abuse, 30%, healthy relationships, 28%, and sexual harassment, 24%, and that was throughout school. So as well as understanding what education had been covered amongst children and young people, the research also aimed to investigate what can make this formal education particularly useful or particularly poor to inform how that education can be designed effectively. We found that there was a really clear pattern for learning about sex in particular. So younger audiences preferred to learn about sex from family and teachers. However, this really declined with age. So only 17% of Key Stage 2 preferred to learn about sex from friends, but this actually increased to 37% amongst Key Stage 5, at which point friends became the most popular source to learn about sex, which indicates a really strong peer influence in this area. So we thought that fostering peer relations that are positive is a really important aspect of formal education in schools. to ensure that those discussions, especially in relation to sex, are respectful and actually helpful for children, offering support to each other rather than perhaps reinforcing stereotypes or myths. In the survey with 18 to 25-year-olds, participants were asked to reflect on what made their relationship, sex and health education that they'd received, and asked them to consider what made it particularly good or particularly useful, as well as particularly poor or not useful. We found that learning about where to get support and having time to ask questions were the top 2 reasons that were stated for finding education on these topics useful. 1 in 4 also selected that they felt that they could discuss things that they wouldn't feel comfortable discussing at home, 26%, and that they felt like they weren't judged, which was 24%, which I think really highlights the importance of creating spaces where young people can feel comfortable and empowered to discuss these issues freely. RSHE that had a social dimension, interestingly, such as school trips or making new friends, was particularly effective at engaging boys. And then when we're reflecting on what made that education particularly poor or not useful, we found some differences between male and female respondents. So we found that a third of women, 31%, found lessons were rushed and awkward compared to 22% of men. And a quarter of women, 24%, found that their education had no understanding of pre-existing trauma compared to 17% of men. The research also looked at the likelihood and confidence in accessing support. So we found a really concerning gap around the lack of awareness about where to get support for domestic abuse if they experienced it at home or in their own relationships amongst children and young people. So while 70% of children and young people said that they would be likely to seek support if they needed it, 61% of these were unsure or didn't know where to go for this. When thinking about why this was, so the most commonly reported reason for concerns was to make the situation worse. That was 36% identified that, or fears of not being taken seriously, 27% identified that. When we asked the older age group as well, they had very similar reasons on why they were hesitant to seek support.
I'm just going to talk a bit now about the findings around attitudes towards domestic abuse among children and young people. We found that the majority of children and young people can distinguish between healthy and unhealthy behaviours in relationships. However, a significant minority do hold attitudes that normalise unhealthy relationships and show that they weren't able to identify coercive and controlling behaviour which underpins domestic abuse. Once again, this was a really strong finding with our adults attitude survey last year. Some examples on this slide, including a fifth of children and young people believe that there should be one more dominant person in a relationship, that men show their love through jealousy, and that behaviours associated with the love bombing were caring or romantic. Gender differences in perceptions were generally limited here. However, girls in Key Stage 2 were significantly more likely than boys to believe you should share the same views on everything to have good friendship. These findings are similar and sometimes increase across the older age group, the 18 to 25-year-olds. So, for example, this age group was significantly more likely to think that there should always be one more dominant person in a relationship, 26% compared to 22% in the younger age group for an equivalent question. They are more likely to associate jealousy with caring or love, 35% compared to 21%. And there was an even greater tolerance of control. So the statement, it's okay to check your partner's outfits before they go to the gym to prevent unwanted attention, 34% of this age group agreed, compared to 17% in the younger age group for an equivalent question. Third, thought that you should always try to make your partner happy, even if you don't feel comfortable doing so. And we can see a gendered impact here, which we'll come back to in just a moment. Almost a quarter of young people did not agree with the statement that you should always have consent from your partner to have sex when you're in an existing relationship. So this finding in particular warrants further exploration, and consent is clearly an essential part of the RHSE curriculum and other ways of reaching young people to talk about healthy relationships. So as I noted, across each of the statements relating to unhealthy attitudes, we saw differences between male and female respondents. So men were significantly more likely to agree with harmful attitudinal statements around relationships compared to women. For example, there should always be one more dominant person in a relationship. 35% of men compared to 19% of women agreed that was the case. Just under half of male respondents believed it's okay to check your partner's outfit before they go to the gym, compared to 25% of female respondents. Being jealous shows you cares was another one, 43% of men compared to 27% of women. And you should always try and make your partner happy, even if you don't feel comfortable doing so. 43% of men agreed with that, compared to 24% of women. Now, there are nuances here, which we will explore in qualitative work to ensure that resources are addressing need. For example, do young men think that they should make their partner happy, or that their partner should make them happy, or both? There's a point as well around cognitive testing of the question itself in that particular example. We deliberately left it open, but we will look to explore what uncomfortable means and how and if that differs between male and female participants, and how that affects how they respond. The findings clearly show the need for resources both in and out of school and online. Say that they need to talk to young men and boys in particular, a finding also reflected in our adult survey last year.
So once we understood some of these attitudes about relationships that were held by children and young people, we wanted to look a bit more closely at what influences these attitudes, particularly those that promote violence against women and girls, domestic abuse and unhealthy relationships. So within this, we looked at exposure to social media, and we found that by Key Stage 3, more than 9 in 10 children, so 96%, had their own smartphone. And this continued to rise basically across the key stages. So clearly this was a space that we need to look more at what the messages were that young people were receiving. We asked about exposure to different social media platforms. This was, of course, not an exhaustive list of platforms, but it does give a bit of a flavour as to how some of those key sites are used. We found that TikTok was the most frequently used social media channel, with more than 1 in 3, 36%, reporting access to this daily. Other popular channels included Snapchat and Instagram, with participants reporting usage at 30% and 26% respectively. Looking at what kind of content, we found that children and young people would seen a range of different content. We found that over half of Key Stage 5 children had seen Andrew Tate's content, and also pornography, as well as supportive posts about where to go for help. So from this, we could see that there was a real range of different influences that young people were coming across online. So look at this a little bit more deeply. We kind of cross-reference these findings on attitudes with these different influences. So questions within this research referred specifically to Andrew Tate's content. However, it is worth noting here that the prevalence of Tate's content is not an isolated phenomenon in and of itself, but rather a one representation of an increasing online existing presence of misogyny and anti-feminist backlash. But however, it did provide us with some vital insight. So the research found that those who'd been exposed to those misogynistic views on social media, such as Andrew Tate, had significantly more harmful perceptions of relationships and a greater tolerance of doing harm. Whilst we can't determine the causal connection and the direction of this within this research, there are clearly significant links between this exposure and harmful perceptions of relationships, which does demonstrate the influence this kind of content has. So just to give some examples, nearly a third of those exposed to this content thought that there should always be one more dominant person in a relationship, compared with 14% who had not seen this content, and almost a fifth, so 19%, who had seen this content thought that hurting someone physically is okay if you say sorry after hurting with them, compared with just 4% of those who had not been exposed. Participants were also more likely to agree with some of the unhealthy perceptions around relationships if they had been exposed to nudity or pornography. Some findings, for example, around this, we found that 28% of children and young people exposed to nudity or pornography agreed with the statement, someone you're going out with will break up with you if you don't kiss them when they want you to, compared with just 8% of those who had not been exposed. 51% of those exposed agreed with the statement the most important thing in a relationship is to make the partner happy no matter what, compared with 37% of those not exposed. And 11% of those exposed to nudity or pornography disagreed that it's important to talk to your partner about whether you're ready to have sex, compared with just 4% of those who'd not been exposed. So I think this really shows that without adequate education on sex and relationships, there's a real risk that young people will learn dynamics from nudity or pornography that they see online and believe that that is an accurate representation of sex. There were other parallels and influences that we've included in the report itself. For example, those around people who have been exposed to content that relates to hatred against women and girls, but we aren't including these here, but do encourage you to have a look at those. The responses to the survey with 18 to 25-year-olds highlighted a more positive picture as well, demonstrating the healthy influence that social media content can have on attitudes. So they gave online content on social media as a key reason for changing their attitudes towards healthy relationships. This is likely to be the case for other young people as well, even those who didn't necessarily recognise the influence that it had here. So to provide some further insight into this, participants were given some space to give open text responses, providing some examples of social media that they found particularly influential. And the examples were overwhelmingly positive. We've included some examples here. So things like infographics describing how and why certain behaviours can be damaging. It gives you reassurance regarding your own experiences and helps you reflect on your own behaviours in past relationships. Seeing things that I previously just would have accepted, being labelled as red flags or signs of abuse, even if that's not just physical, and influencers who focus on women's rights and equality, as well as professionals who specialise in relationships. So aside from social media, other spaces in and out of school were also shown to be really important influencers, which again further demonstrates why we need a holistic response to this. So, for example, 35% reported that the reason that they had an increased interest in issues surrounding Vogue, patriarchy, sexism, and domestic abuse was learning about them more through the news and media, as well as exposure to these issues on TV and film. Personal experiences as well during secondary school in particular were commonly reported as reasons for changing a level of interest in these issues. And here we actually get some differences between men and women. So 22% of women noted that a personal experience of sexual harassment had changed their level of interest in these issues, compared to 15% of men. And 19% of women noted that a personal experience of domestic abuse had changed their level of interest, compared to 12% of men.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm just going to finish this section of the webinar by talking a little bit about how we're using the findings in our research. You'll see in the report we've included a set of recommendations for government departments focusing around RSHE in schools and the Department of Education's current review of RSHE guidance. The findings and recommendations in this research, as well as other expertise and experience in the Vogue sector, should feed into the review. Please do look at the other recommendations in the report in full, as well as the full findings from this research. A key part of the What Works Research in Practice project is that research underpins the school and online products that we're developing at Women's Aid, and the research pulls the whole thing together with the findings feeding into all of the products that we're developing. That includes our digital resources, which this research shows are vital, and our continuing evaluation and research activities throughout the project will continue to inform their development. We know that many young people trust digital spaces, so there's a real need for reputable, safe information around healthy relationships to meet young people where they are. There are huge opportunities for young people to benefit from digital engagement, so whether that's reading a variety of resources, being able to share their own story, or connecting with other young people who have similar experiences. So it's vital that we use our research to get this right. We've relaunched a newly accessible version of our website for young people, Love Respect, as part of this project, and with more content on recognising unhealthy relationships, understanding coercive control, online abuse, asking adults for help, and more. As well as Love Respect, the project includes using our research to inform development of content for our TikTok channel to create a platform for talking. We know from this research that 36% of children and young people report using TikTok daily, rising to 60% of Key Stage 5 girls, as you can see on the slide. So this is a key space. So far, we have over 11,000 followers with a growing engagement rate, and we're using the findings from our ongoing research to support content creation, join conversations young people are already having, jump on trends that users are participating in, and engage with other users and creators on the platform. Women's Aid, as part of this project, are further developing our Expect Respect training for schools, as well as the digital resources. So this research and our ongoing evaluation is also constantly informing that development to shape a training offering, which is based on an understanding of gender inequality with sensitivity to pre-existing experiences and beliefs, which the research shows is what works for children and young people and is essential to make sure children and young people feel safe and empowered in their learning. So just to conclude, having a research in practice, evidence-based approach to development across this diverse set of tools means that we can increase and monitor impact by working from a shared starting point. So having identified through research the need that we must address and working with practice teams to put it into action, then monitoring, gathering data to evaluate our impact and learn about what works for children and young people in ways that crucially include at their heart children and young people's voices. I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues Yasmin and Georgie to talk more about Expect Respect.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Sarika and Catherine, for going through that research. I've been lucky enough to be able to read it and absolutely recommend that everyone goes away and reads that research. But we've also been lucky enough to be able to utilise that research to help us develop a programme for schools, which we've called Expect Respect. So in a moment, I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Georgie, who is one of our children and young people's officers at Women's Aid, to talk through how we took some of the findings of the research to help us develop the school sessions. So welcome, Georgie.
Thank you. So we just wanted to take you through a few of the key findings that we took from the research and how that's impacted what's gone on into our school sessions. So the first one that we were really struck by was the impact of misogynistic online content. So from the research, we know that children and young people exposed to misogynistic social media content, for example, Andrew Tate, were almost 5 times more likely than those not exposed to this to view hurting someone physically as acceptable if you say sorry afterwards. So one of the first things we've taken out that runs through all of our school sessions is tackling gender stereotypes. So the sessions are really aimed all the way through at helping children and young people to identify the sources, impacts, and the harms of gender stereotypes as a foundation to understanding why abuse happens, why abuse isn't okay. We also help them to develop critical thinking skills. So it's not necessarily about thinking about one online influencer in particular, or even exactly what it is they're saying, but giving them the critical thinking skills they need, that when they do see that content coming up on their social media, when they do hear their friends or their family members talking about it, they have those critical thinking skills in place that they can think about it for themselves and form their own opinions that are hopefully a lot healthier. And also helping them to draw that link between misogynistic social media content and real life behaviors. How and why what they see online impacts what happens in real life and why that's important. So the second thing we've taken from that is how to engage boys. So we know from the research that girls had significantly better understanding than boys of domestic abuse and healthy relationships. And one of the recommendations being that RSHE could be improved to specifically target boys' relationship literacy. So when we're talking about gender stereotypes in these sessions, we talk about the harms of gender stereotypes to boys and men, as well as to women and girls, exploring why these traditional ideas of being quote unquote masculine might be damaging, why men being strong, not being allowed to express emotion, being jealous, all these different kinds of stereotypes that they encounter damage them and can damage their healthy relationships in the future as well. And the third one we wanted to talk about was seeking support. So I think one of the most striking findings from the research is that while 70% of children and young people said they would seek support if they needed, only about 61% of them weren't sure and didn't know where to go for support. So that's a really important part of the work that we're doing when we're encountering so many children and young people across the programme, being able to provide resources for them to seek support and to keep learning as well. We're aware that when we go into schools, that's one session, but as useful as that might be, what's really important is the conversation that it sparks afterwards and the thoughts and the learning process that the children and young people have, both in and outside of the classroom once the session's over. So one of the things we do is we provide resources to enable them to seek support, to enable them to keep learning. So as Sarah mentioned, our Love Respect website is a really key part of this. It provides information for 14 to 25-year-olds where they, if they're not sure about a relationship, if they're not sure if something counts as healthy, if it counts as abuse, they can find more. And then we, of course, have all of our social media platforms. We know that social media is incredibly important to children and young people. And if they're spending so much of their time there, we want to make sure that the content they're seeing is providing positive information and positive learning rather than something that's damaging. And then we also make sure that we signpost to other organisations, so Childline being a key example, so that every child and every young person who sees our sessions and is concerned makes sure that they have somewhere to go after the session's done. Oh, sorry, Yasmin, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Georgie. So we had a look at the research and we really wanted to ensure that all of the school sessions that we're delivering were informed by children and young people and what they've said that they want from RSHE in school. We know that research showed 1 in 3 women experienced the RSHE sessions they had in school as rushed and awkward, and 1 in 4 women felt they had no understanding of pre-existing trauma. Children and young people have told us that they want RSHE, that it is inclusive, that it's trauma-informed, and is also delivered by adults who are supportive and are also experts on the topics that are being discussed. Recommendations from the research included that RSHE should be designed based on an understanding of gender inequality, but also with sensitivity to pre-existing experiences and beliefs. So our school sessions really spend a lot of time unpicking gender and gender stereotypes and where we learn those ideas about what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, and what impacts they have in the ways that we treat each other. So we spend time exploring all of those gender stereotypes, as well as domestic abuse and healthy relationships. And we ensure that we always take a trauma-informed approach, and all of our sessions are delivered by our wonderful training officers in a supportive and sensitive way. And they're designed to be as inclusive as possible to maximise participation and to really encourage meaningful conversations, both in the classroom and outside of the classroom. So I'll talk through the school sessions in a moment. But in addition to working with children and young people, we also provide training for teachers and school staffs prior to the school sessions. We really want to be able to empower teachers and school staff with the information that they need to be able to support their students during the sessions that we're delivering and also afterwards. Because we really want these conversations about gender stereotypes, about gender inequality, healthy relationships and domestic abuse. We really want them to continue after we've left the sessions, after our sessions with the children and young people have been completed. So I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of what the schools programme looks like. So as I've said, our Expect Respect programme for schools is aimed at increasing understanding of gender stereotypes, gender inequality, healthy relationships and domestic abuse. So the way that it's designed is that there are different sessions for each of the different key stages, and that each key stage really builds on the last to provide more information in a really age-appropriate way. So what we are currently offering schools is free in-person training workshops across England. That starts with a 2-hour staff training for all staff members before the sessions for children and young people, which covers topics such as safeguarding processes, disclosure management, trauma-informed classroom management, and also provides them with the tools for cultural change within the school. We also provide sessions for children and young people aged ages 4 to 18. So as I said, it's designed for the different key stages to build on. So ideally, a child will experience all of our sessions throughout their school life. We start by discussing gender stereotypes and safe relationships with reception and Key 1, as we know that gender inequality underpins domestic abuse, and empowering children to be aware of gender stereotypes and be able to challenge them is a really important part of prevention. And we build on these conversations to talk more about domestic abuse, about coercive control and healthy relationships. And our programme is designed to be inclusive of children with special educational needs and also children who speak English as a second language. And we are able to provide language interpreters to provide support to the school sessions. Great. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you for having us, giving us opportunity to talk in this webinar to share some of the work that we're doing in schools. If you're interested, please do get in touch. Our email address, cyp@womensaid.org.uk, is on the slide there. And I think we will be sending the slides out at the end of the session as well. So we absolutely encourage you to get in touch. And if there's any questions as well, we'd be happy to try and answer them.
Thank you very much, both. Okay, so just wanted to say that, as we mentioned earlier, this research is really key to informing practice. So there's a range of different ways in which we can support you and work with you. We've talked about our work in schools. We also have packages to work with professionals, and we have our domestic abuse training, domestic abuse matters training with the police. We can also provide support to local authorities, so including support and needs assessments, and we can also support with survivor engagement in a range of different forums. So please do get in touch.